Shalom and welcome to this edition of Revealing the Truth, where we cover the headlines, the heartlines, and biblical truth. I'm your host, the Reverend Rabbi Eric Walker, and I've got a question for you. What do you think they're doing with your DNA that you've been sending off to 23andMe and all those different places trying to find out who you are? You know, all that goes into a database, and what if that database was important to someone you don't want it to be important to? His name is Satan. Why would he be interested in your DNA? Because they can now weaponize DNA and take out a specific race of people using weaponized DNA. Well, why would that matter to you as a believer in the promised Messiah's return? Because there is a Y chromosome marker that determines who is a descendant of Aaron. Anyone who's a descendant of Aaron can ascend to the high priest role of leading the Sanhedrin. Matthew 23:37 through 39, you see Jesus say, I will not return until Jerusalem calls for my return. That has to be a high priest in place. My book, The Codist, complete examination of this marvel, this thriller, this enmity between the seed of the woman and the seed of the serpent, playing out in weaponized DNA to wipe out the Levitical priesthood so that Jesus doesn't return. The Codist, a biblical thriller like none other, on sale now for $2.99 on Kindle. Get your copy. And also visit our website, ignitingnation.com, and scroll to the bottom of the page where it says special offers. You'll see a cover of my latest book, The 7 Laws of Abundant Living, Lessons Learned from the Tree of Life. Click on the book cover. We're going to ask for your email address, but we won't send you spam because spam's not kosher. But we will send you the first chapter of this book for free. Take a journey with me in the Garden of Eden, all the way from the dirt in the Garden of Eden all the way out to the fruit of the tree of life, the same tree we see in the book of Revelation in the new heaven and the new earth. Get your copy today. It's our pleasure to introduce you to our guest this morning, Dan Stanford, author of the newly released book, Losing the Cape, The Power of Ordinary in a World of Superheroes. Dan is not a comic book superhero. He doesn't have a catchphrase like up, up, and Yahweh. And there's no blockbuster movie about his heroic deeds. He's an ordinary, decaf-drinking, nap-taking, Jesus-loving citizen, but in spite of being ordinary, he married his true love, Suzanne, and they have 3 dynamic boys, Caleb, Connor, and Colton. Dan holds a master's degree from Trinity International University and started the Well Church in Kenosha, Wisconsin. To learn more about him, visit www.danstanford.net. Well, Dan, welcome to Revealing the Truth.
Good morning. Thank you for having me on. I'm still laughing about the we won't send you spam because spam's not kosher. That's hilarious.
Well, thank you. Thank you. That's been a catchphrase of mine for a long time and trying to solicit and build our email database is that it's simple. The rabbi won't send you spam because it's not kosher. So
That's brilliant.
There you go. Dan, I love the whole concept. You kind of stripped away this superhero kind of model that we are so drawn to. I look at the box office and year in and year out, Netflix, top binge watching, the Avengers, all these things. And I grew up in the 50s, just at the beginning of comic books. Stan Lee, Jewish man, this idea of superheroes coming from honestly a biblical Goliath, heroic, mighty men of God kind of, or mighty men, the Zeuses and the Thors and all these characters of mythology have captured our imagination. As a young boy, what was your imagination like, and how was it shaped and fed and encouraged?
Yeah. So like you, grew up on comic books. 1938 was the first comic book hero, Superman, and he looks pretty good for being 80 years old. And it's interesting to me. So, as a kid, I would put the sheet around my neck and pretend to fly around the living room, and eventually outgrew that because my wife said it wasn't that cute. But comics played a huge influence, especially because I was always the small kid. I was always short. I was always skinny. I say I'm built a lot like Where's Waldo. And so, you could feel pretty inferior, going into school, going into places where everyone seemed to hit their growth spurt a lot earlier than you. And so comic book characters were a real inspiration for me, feeling like, well, if I just only had their powers, if I just only had what they could do, then I could feel a lot more secure and a lot more significant.
Now, where was faith in all this? Where was your identity being formed? Here you're looking to get out of the, back in the day, the back of the comic book was the picture of the 98-pound weakling
Uh-huh.
having sand kicked in his face by the big buff guy, and you would take and you would cut out the coupon, and you would mail off a quarter or $2.50 to get an extra, say, would be 3 springs with a handle,
Hmm.
the hand grip, and there was one other item that would come in the package. And if you did all those things, you'd become like Jack LaLanne, and you wouldn't that 98-pound weakling anymore, and you'd be the guy that could kick the sand back in their face. And that was the advertising on the comic books,
Hmm.
along with tricks and the telescope that left a black eye and all those old time kind of jokes that we would play on each other as kids. But here you are, you're a pastor today, so somewhere along the way there had to be some influence that came into your life that was kind of extraordinary.
Sure. Yeah, there was always that before and after picture at the back of them, and I was always the before, and I tried a couple of those things. I did like protein supplements and stuff with the guarantee that do this for 30 days, you'll be ripped and have the six pack, and it just made me feel bloated and never gave the six pack. But to just give you a little background, I grew up with a mom who was a believer and a dad who was not. And so I got a very mixed message in my household.
Mm.
And so my mom would take me to church as a kid. I got baptized when I was 5 years old. And so I kind of grew up with that influence, but at the same time, dad would never go. About the only time I ever saw him crack open a Bible or listen to a Carmen CD is when my mom threatened divorce. And he knew, oh man, I better do something radical to grab her attention. And so I fell away from church and influence and followed my dad's path all the way up until I was 18 years old. I got involved in the drug culture. In fact, I sold drugs outside of my house, right out the window, almost like a McDonald's drive-through, 1 block from the police station. And so I went down that path really hard, all until I hit the proverbial rock bottom where I lost my girlfriend. I couldn't retain a job. I was in trouble with the drug dealer that I was selling for. And I had a couple of bad experiences with alcohol and drugs. And so one night I prayed an agnostic prayer of God, I don't know if you're real. I mean, I grew up in the church, but that hasn't been a part of my life. But if you are real, I need you to get me out of Zion, which is where I grew up, Zion, Illinois. And that very week, my grandparents, who lived in Crivitz, Wisconsin, if you've ever felt lost, you know what it's like to live in Crivitz, Wisconsin, because it's in the middle of nowhere. And they came without me talking to anybody. I didn't talk to my parents. I didn't talk to anybody. I just said the prayer to God. They showed up that very week and they said, hey, we were praying this week. God put you on our heart, and we feel like He wants you to come live with us in Crivitz, Wisconsin. And so I went with them, and it was my grandparents who were the ones who spoke into my life and let me know that no matter how far off track I had been, no matter how much of the villain I had been, that God still had a plan for my life. And if I would just give it over to Jesus, He's the best recycler in the universe. He can take all the garbage and He can turn it into something beautiful. And it was their influence that really turned me around.
So, godly family being your grandparents who pulled you out of the depths. You're late teens now. You're not 13, 14, 15. You're now in the senior in high school or finished.
Yeah, I was a dropout. I dropped out in 10th grade, And but it was around the age of 17, 18 that I went to live with them, and they had the impact that they did.
So, how did you wind up getting a master's degree um, after dropping out of high school?
Yeah. Well, God made me a nerd. As soon as I turned my life over to Him, I became insatiably hungry to study. I started reading the Bible right away. I would go from cover to cover and just keep, recycling through that. I would get a hold of any book I could get my hands on. And while I was still living with them, I felt like God put on my heart first a desire to write a letter to all the friends that I had negatively impacted and to tell them about Jesus and this newfound hope that I experienced, this newfound transformation. I mailed it off to them, and there are actually several of them that attend my church to this day because of that initial, what I call my first sermon. But while I was there and I started getting that stirring, that desire to basically help other people avoid the same pitfalls and problems that I had gone through, I decided that the best route would be for me to go get my GED, go back to school, and pursue an education so that I had some knowledge to back up what I knew was true in my heart. And so I went off to college. It was rough at first. Like I said, I had dropped out in 10th grade, so I had a bit of a learning gap to get across. But once I started moving in that direction, I had plenty of people who came alongside of me, believed in me, helped me, and eventually went off and got my master's degree. So quite a turnaround.
It is quite a turnaround. Now, you wind up getting your master's degree. You meet Suzanne. How does this 98-pound, wispy, where's Waldo kind of guy get the girl?
Probably the most important question that everyone wants to know is how do you get the girl when you're Clark Kent and you're not Superman?
Right.
Um, we started working together. I was a youth pastor at a church in Waukegan, and she came alongside, and she was a piano player, and she liked to work on dramas, and I started writing music. I've always been a little bit of an artist at heart. So anything that I can do to have kind of a creative outlet, whether it's music or writing or drawing, any of those types of things, are big for me. And so we started writing music together as friends, and it was one of those things that was definitely not love at first sight. In fact, one of the first times she ever saw me was preaching, and she will tell you, and she's happy to tell you, that it was the worst sermon she'd ever heard. She had zero interest, and but it was only through our friendship and our common points of interest that we started developing a relationship that then blossomed into the boy getting the girl who is definitely out of my league, and I definitely married up.
When you look at your life, when did the call to full-time ministry come, and how did you wrestle with or reconcile with your perception, self-perception was ordinary versus extraordinary, and here you're going into the shark-infested waters,
Mm-hmm.
wearing a meat suit, not a Superman outfit,
Mm-hmm.
and you're going in, diving in to the field, which unfortunately is the only army in the world that shoots its wounded.
Yeah, true.
So, how did this call come about for you, and what part did Suzanne play in that?
Sure. Like I said, around the age of 18, I first started experiencing that desire, but I didn't feel qualified. I felt a lot like Moses when he's having the burning bush experience, and he's like, "Who am I to go talk to Pharaoh?" And I love the fact that God doesn't really answer the question, but rather says, "I will be with you." In other words, Moses, it's not really about your resume. It's not really about your qualifications. It's the fact that I will be there and I'm qualified and I've got the resume. And so it was first my grandparents who spoke into my life and just let me know that, yeah, I was the drug addict. Yeah, I was the alcoholic. Yeah, I was the drug dealer. But those things don't define me. God defines me.
Right.
The one who created me is the one who defines me. And so they had to, keep speaking that into me because believe me, when you have that tragic backstory, the enemy loves to bring it up as often as possible to try and make you feel like, I don't deserve to be in this platform. I don't deserve to share this message. And so the way my wife helped me and still helps me is she's just that constant reminder that God doesn't call the qualified, he qualifies the called, to use a cliche that's been used multiple times.
Right.
And that it's not about me. In fact, I used to say all the time, I'm a nobody trying to tell everybody about somebody. And bottom line, it's not about my qualifications. I can have the master's degree on the wall. I can have, the pastoral certificate. But ultimately, what matters is, did God call me? Is His hands on my life? Because that's really all that matters, is His smile and His backing.
Well, you certainly have the right attitude about it. As you look at Scripture, God always used the ordinary to do the extraordinary.
Hmm.
It's interesting, as you get into your book, you take a look at two Peters, Peter Parker and Shimon Kefa, or Simon Peter.
Yeah,
Give me the parallels between those two, uh,
sure.
and this kind of launches us into the discussion of uh, being the power of ordinary in a world of superheroes.
Yeah. So Peter Parker, or Spider-Man, was always my favorite superhero because he was skinny, he was sarcastic, and he has probably one of the coolest lines spoken to him by his Uncle Ben: with great power comes great responsibility.
Mm.
But for Peter Parker, he didn't look at it that way initially. He gets these powers, and in the comic book, and in what's actually shown in the first trilogy of the Spider-Man movie, is he actually initially uses those powers to go wrestle so that he can make enough money to buy a car to impress a girl. Just because you have the power doesn't make you a hero. There's enough villains who also have all those same powers. It's about what you do with those powers. And so for Peter Parker, he has to come to this place of realizing that I've been given this gift so that I can't just serve myself, but I can serve others. Or I like to look at it this way: God says to Abraham, I blessed you so that you can be a blessing. I haven't given you your riches for your own wishes, but so that you can go and serve and help out other people. That leads me to Peter of the New Testament, is that Peter, he doesn't feel very qualified either. I mean, you see him fail over and over again, and it's Jesus. And I think one of my favorite lines after the resurrection, when the angel goes and says, tell the disciples and Peter that
Right.
the Lord has returned, is this reminder that, hey, Peter, you failed, you messed up, but that does not disqualify you from being used by God. And I love that, because just like with Ben saying to Peter Parker, with whom much power is given, much responsibility, Jesus will say essentially the same thing to when he says, to whom much is given, much is required. Or yeah, go ahead.
Well, thematically, most of our modern day movies, literature, and comics are based on this battle between good and evil.
Hmm.
It's fundamental. It goes back to the Garden of Eden. We look at this fallen angel who was the wisest. He was the most powerful. He could travel from the earth through the atmosphere, through outer space, and into the third heaven, right to the throne of God. Uh, intergalactic travel,
Hmm.
the whole concept of aliens and UFOs and all these things that our imagination, the Bible has very clear explanations for all of that.
Sure.
Uh, we fail to connect it because we're entertained, and we wind up drawing these comparisons which lead us to dissatisfaction.
Mm-hmm.
We all have an arch enemy, every one of us that gives our life to Jesus. We have this arch enemy that it can't destroy us.
Mm-hmm.
Luke 10:19 tells us that Jesus says, I've given you the authority to trample on snakes and scorpions and overcome all the power of the enemy.
Mm-hmm.
Nothing whatsoever shall harm you. So we don't have kryptonite. We're our own kryptonite. You know, that's our battle internally, is the self-inflicted or making my kryptonite in my own lab.
Yeah.
You can't wipe me out with it, but I can wipe myself out with it. Sin is crouching at the door. If I don't tame it, if I don't master it, it's going to devour me.
Mm-hmm.
This is the same scenario for these superheroes. So you began to identify, and in your sermons, in your life, in your analogies, you began to see this pattern of how we become enamored with the superheroes. Do we get lost in the imagination? Do we get envious? Do we step out of our ordinary selves and want to take on that identity? Is it an identity crisis? What's really going on there?
Sure. I've got three sons, as you mentioned at the beginning, ranging from teenager to toddler. And one of them jumped off of our garage recently and hurt his ankle. And when I asked him why, I got an unexpected answer. He says, I want to be like my hero. And I'm assuming because I'm his dad that he must be speaking about me. But he says, no, I mean Batman. I want to be more like Batman. And my initial thought is, well, first of all, he's fictional, but second, Batman's a billionaire. He can afford the medical bills.
Right.
Dad's a pastor. He's a hundredaire. He can't afford the medical bills. Let's not jump off the garage. And I think there's something in human nature that desires to be more, to feel secure, to feel significant. And we see that in these superheroes. I mentioned earlier about Superman 1938. What's fascinating to me is the context that we find that coming out is we have the Great Depression going on.
Right.
World War I had just ended. World War II is about to begin. And you see that there's something attractive about this godlike being who can have bullets bounce off his chest and take out Nazis with one punch. And in a context where people are feeling insecure and they're feeling insignificant, there's this desire to be able to escape that insecurity. And we often do that through our entertainment, and to enter into that and to feel like, if only I could be like those people. Well, you look at right now, Marvel is just making a killing in its movies. I mean, they have 5 different movies that have made $1 billion plus. The latest one, Infinity War, is going to surpass $1 billion easily. I think it was like 700 million their opening weekend. I mean, a ridiculous amount. Just shows the attraction that is going on with these. And what's interesting, you kind of started off talking about, we all have an enemy. Well, with the Marvel series, I mean, the last 10 years have all been leading up to this one main villain, Thanos. Thanos is trying to go throughout the universe, and I jokingly say he's got like a Michael Jackson-like glove where he's trying to bedazzle it with these Infinity Stones to acquire this power, so he can basically wipe things out with a snap of his finger. But we have an enemy that is so much greater, the devil. And like you pointed out, the devil has no power over us as Christians. I like to say he can hand you the gun, but you have to pull the trigger. That he can tempt us. He can be the one who leads things into our path, but ultimately we have to be our own worst enemy. And I think it's important as Christians for us to realize that in spite of all this draw towards superheroes, God didn't send Superman, Batman, Wonder Woman. He didn't send the Avengers. He sent ordinary people like you and me to be his hands and feet in the power of Jesus. And in that, we don't have to worry about Thanos. We don't have to worry about Satan. We just have to worry about our own worst enemy, which is ourselves. But if we can overcome that, we can make a huge difference in this world.
Well, we're talking with Pastor Dan Stanford, author of Losing the Cape, The Power of Ordinary in a World of Superheroes. All of us are familiar with the comic book characters, the movies, that these is a worldwide phenomenon. All throughout Europe, many of the Asian countries are just enamored with this superhero model. Yet Dan's premise is that there's power in the ordinary, and where you make a real difference is not able to leap tall buildings with a single bound, able to run faster than a speeding bullet. All these things are inconsequential when you talk about you have the power to change someone's life for eternity. We're going to take a short break, and when we come back, we're going to talk about the ordinary versus the extraordinary. Being ordinary and not a superhero. We'll be right back. Shalom. I'm the Reverend Rabbi Eric Walker, Executive Director of Igniting a Nation and host of the daily TV program Revealing the Truth, seen live every Monday through Friday from 9 a.m. to 1 p.m. Central Standard Time at www.ianbn.com, and then replayed throughout the day and night via our website. All of our segments can be seen on the Igniting a Nation YouTube channel. Since our launch in January of this year, we've expanded our global reach to over 54 countries with a social media following of over 125,000. Our commitment is to bring you the most in-depth interviews with authors, subject matter experts, and thought leaders from around the world. We have interviewed guests from Israel, Brazil, England, India, and all across North America. All of our authors are featured on the Books and Media page on our website, www.ianbn.com. There you can find a direct link to the book you want to order, and we receive a small commission directly from Amazon. There is no cost to you for this service. In addition to our daily teachings and interviews, we make available to you the archive of all of the interviews on our YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram channels. Our live program is available from our homepage, and there is never a charge to you for any of this access. We made the decision long ago that we would remain a commercial-free resource that would not be influenced by any pressure from any outside company. There are only two ways that we are able to continue to operate this ministry and provide you with the only live 4-hour daily Christian television talk show program. The first is through your support and tax-deductible contributions to Igniting a Nation. These can be made directly through the donate button on the website or sent through the mail to Igniting a Nation, 2700 Corporate Drive, Suite 120, Birmingham, Alabama, 35242. The other way we support the program is by offering you a unique opportunity to have access to over 10 years worth of teachings on a subscription basis. The teaching archives contains all of my prior sermons, Torah studies, prophecy in the news videos, and much more for the low subscription price of $5 per month. This subscription grants you unlimited access to over 800 hours of content not available elsewhere and is updated weekly with the most current prophecy classes. In addition to 20 hours of original TV programming each weekday, we invite you to join us live every Monday, Tuesday, and Thursday evenings for our Prophecy in the News classes. The times and locations are listed on our events page on the website www.ianbn.com. Every day, you and I are faced with the challenge of where we will go to hear the truth. We are committed to bring you the only program of its kind that covers the headlines, the heartlines, and biblical truth. We cannot do this without your support. Since we launched on January 5th, 2017, we have aired over 300 individual teachings, interviews, and commentaries not available anywhere else. We are now working side by side with almost every major Christian publishing house to bring you the most in-depth feature interviews possible. Our 1-hour features address every subject that affects the believer's life. We are hearing of salvations from the Middle East, Africa, and all across the United States. Lives are being changed every day, and we have only just begun. Our mission is to become your trusted resource and grant you access to the people, tools, and information you need to grow in your relationship with the Lord. You can help us by liking us on social media and through your financial support. We know you have many choices in who you support, but we are prayerfully asking you to consider helping us keep revealing the truth, true to our calling, to cover the headlines, the heartlines, and biblical truth like no other program available. Donate today and help us bring the message to the four corners of the earth. Visit www.ianbn.com and donate, buy a book, or subscribe to our teaching archives. Without you, we do not exist. Shalom and welcome back to this edition of Revealing the Truth, where we cover the headlines, the heartlines, and biblical truth. I'm your host, the Reverend Rabbi Eric Walker, and we're talking with Dan Stanford, author of Losing the Cape, The Power of Ordinary in a World of Superheroes. Boy, Dan, welcome back to the program. Just so enjoying this time with you.
Thank you. I'm enjoying myself as well.
You've introduced a word from our vocabulary that is almost worse than being called a misogynist or a bigot or a racist or an Islamophobe. You've introduced the word ordinary, something that no one aspires to be.
Sure.
What do you want to be when you grow up, son? Dad, I want to be ordinary. Okay? What's your highest, most lofty, wonderful goal? Is I want to be the most ordinary person that ever existed. This is not something we aspire to be. But yet, you've been able to capture a whole new view of why ordinary is extraordinary. Give me your impression of ordinary and what that's defined as in your world.
Sure. I think that if I were to go to one of my three boys and say that was the most mediocre job I've ever seen, they would feel pretty insulted. You know, if I say, hey, we should go watch a movie at the theater this weekend, it's called Ordinary Boy, they would not be interested. And so ordinary is oftentimes seen as kind of a derogatory term, something that none of us aspire to. But what really got me interested in this word, what really got me interested in this concept, as I was reading through the book of Acts, the first 30 years of church history, and I came across Acts chapter 4, verse 13, where it says that the religious leaders, they're looking at the disciples, the first followers of Jesus, and said that they were ordinary men, but they had been with Jesus. They were ordinary men, but they had been with Jesus. And so in the eyes of the world, these were just ordinary guys. They weren't the celebrities. They weren't rich. They didn't have the same rabbinical training. They're just ordinary individuals, people you don't expect a whole lot from, and yet they're the very people Jesus handpicked and turned the world upside down. I mean, we're sitting here having this conversation because of those ordinary guys. And so the more I started thinking about it, the more I started kind of agreeing with C.S. Lewis, where he says that you've never really met an ordinary person. It's all a matter of perspective. Just because we're ordinary in the eyes of this culture doesn't mean that we're ordinary in the eyes of God. God created us in his image, which is anything but ordinary. And he created us with sky-high potential, and he's given us these gifts and these resources. And as I was thinking about it, I started thinking about Jeremiah. And, God tells Jeremiah, he says, you're going to be a prophet to the nations. And what really struck me about that is that you never see Jeremiah pack his bags. He never takes a global tour. He basically, Egypt, Israel is about as far as he gets as far as landscape, geography. And yet we see his words have echoed throughout all the nations. I mean, how many people have been encouraged by Jeremiah 29:11, for I know the plans I have for you, plans to prosper you, not to harm you, to give you hope and a future. And even though that's oftentimes taken out of context and not used in an exegetically correct way, we see that his words have encouraged billions of people. And yet, if you were to ask Jeremiah at the time, he would have said, I'm an ordinary guy. I feel like my ministry has been kind of a failure. Nobody gets excited when I get up to preach. Nobody's setting up, a huge tent revival starring Jeremiah. And yet we see that God used this ordinary guy to have an extraordinary impact. And I think ordinary becomes much more attractive when we realize that.
Well, certainly one of the few prophets that has two books in the Bible,
Yeah,
Book of Jeremiah and the Book of Lamentations. Uh, the interesting part about Jeremiah 29:11 is this pattern of a superhero saying, Nell's strapped to the railroad ties, and have no fear, underdog is here, is Jeremiah 29:11.
yeah,
But Jeremiah 29:12 begins telling Israel, you're going to spend 2 years of the worst possible scenario. But I want to tell you first, have no fear, underdog is here. But here's what's going to happen, and I'm going to weep for the nation because God has revealed to me to give you this message to the king as to what's coming.
mm-hmm.
But in his own ordinary way, he's really that underdog character of Nell strapped to the railroad ties.
Yeah, yeah,
When we look at heroism and we look at ministry and we look at the ministry of the people of the Bible, who became your heroes in the Bible? Who did you, now that you were more grounded, your faith was firm, and your identity was not going to be shaped by Superman, Batman, whichever one of the characters you were enamored with at the time, now
sure.
you get to choose who you want to relate to, and it changes in seasons.
Mm-hmm.
So where are you in your identity today related to someone who would be considered quote unquote ordinary in the Bible?
Sure. For me, it was definitely Paul was the one that I resounded with most and identified with most for a couple of reasons. One is that he starts off as the villain. He starts off trying to persecute the church. I mean, he thinks that he's doing what's right in the eyes of God, and he's being zealous for his faith. But though he's sincere, he's wrong, and yet God gets a hold of him and radically turns him around. I mean, he takes him on a 180. I was laughing. I was watching an interview with Jason Kidd one time, and he got on. And he says, "I want to turn this basketball team around 360 degrees." And it's like, well, that's the same direction as what you're already going.
Right.
And but with Saul, he takes him 180. He's going one way negatively, and then God turns around and he starts heading another way positively. And his reputation's so bad that the early church don't even want to embrace him at first. They think that this is all just a ploy, it's a trick. And it takes Barnabas, kind of convincing them that no, this is legit. I mean, the God that we said is powerful enough to redeem us has done this with this guy Saul. And so that was the first thing that I found attractive about him, is that just with my own past, with all the bad that I had done, realizing that God can still use me. But the other thing I loved about Paul is his sky-high courage. Paul is the guy, and my favorite story is where he's in a city, they beat him, they stone him, they drag him outside of the city thinking he's dead. He gets back up and marches right back into that same city. And the reason why that's so important for me is that I deal with a lot of fears, a lot of things that scare me. Heights is one of them. I'm 6'1". I don't like anything taller than 6'2". I get vertigo. In fact, I jokingly say that one of my biggest fears about when Christ comes to get us and take us home is I'm going to be the person who loses his cookies around the stratosphere. Not what you want to be known for all of eternity. And yet, God has called me to fly on a number of occasions. I went to Ireland and I helped plant a church over there. That's 7.5 hours, 30,000 feet up in the air. Not something that I'm comfortable with, something that I'm scared to death of. But courage isn't the absence of fear. It's learning to do things while you're afraid. And the thing I love about Paul is that he had the courage to do hard things, even though it was scary. God never said that he would give us a scaryless life, but he said that he would be with us no matter what fears we had to face.
Paul's story is so interesting because he was the chief rabbi of Turkey
Mm.
and would make these pilgrimages no less than 3 times a year to Jerusalem as required by the law. And as zealous as he was about the law is as zealous as he became. So this transformation that he speaks of in 2 Corinthians 5:17 all the way through 6:10, this complete model for what we're supposed to be as believers. We spend more time talking about the Acts chapter 2 church than we do talking about the relationship and image of Messiah. We've gotten off track because it's about personal contact. Now, imagine if Jesus being your superhero. He can raise the dead. There's no other superhero in the world that raises the dead, heals the blind, forgives sins. This is the superhero of all superheroes. And he's called you to be a co-superhero with him by living out this life where you're going to touch many lives as an ordinary citizen of this earth. So how do we grab a hold of this power of ordinary? What's the model for that, and what impact does it have?
Sure. I think that there is no greater dynamic duo than us locking arms with God. I can't think of anything more satisfying than laying my head on a pillow at night and knowing that I made an eternal difference in someone else's life. But like Paul says, I want to know him and the power of his resurrection. I know that I can't do anything to eternally impact another human being without it being through the power of Jesus. It's got to be birthed in prayer, it's got to be birthed in the Word, and it has to be a complete partnership between me and God. And just give a quick story to kind of illustrate that. When I first started out as a minister, I did a church plant, and I was told that my influence would be basically 10 years older than me, 10 years younger than me. And because I was in my 20s, I expected to have a very young-looking church. Well, the first 2 people I baptized were in their 70s, Dave and Barb Clark. And Dave and Barb, they revolutionized the way I looked at the older generation. They were the first ones to come in and help set up chairs. They were the first ones to offer to make a pot of coffee at home, bring that in so that everyone else could have something to drink. Barb would make chocolate chip cookies every Sunday, homemade chocolate chip cookies, not raisin cookies, chocolate chip cookies. And kids would be lined up at the door waiting for her, and a few adults, to be honest, would be waiting for her to come through. And they revolutionized what servanthood looked like in our church. Now, they wouldn't have seen themselves as heroes. They weren't going to be the one who's going to get up and preach the sermon. But they showed that you don't need an S on your chest when you have a Savior in your heart. And when you're willing to lock arms with God at whatever level that is, if it's making the cookies, it's making the coffee, it's setting up chairs, or it's the one who's giving the sermon, all of us equally important in furthering the kingdom of God. And so I love Dave and Barb's. I love ordinary people who are willing to say, you know what, kind of like Isaiah, here am I, send me. I don't know how much I have to offer personally, but whatever it is, God, it's yours.
So this is the model of no matter what you do, show up. Show up at church. Show up in your community. Show up in your kids' school. Show up. The assignment may not come until you arrive.
Sure.
The superhero phenomena is they're faced with the nemesis, and they know what the goal is to defeat the nemesis. It's always the same plot. Right? There's somebody who wants to destroy the world, and somebody has to save the world. Same plot, every kind of possible scenario you can imagine. But isn't that what we're charged with, you and I and everyone else, is to just share the gospel? People come to salvation one person at a time. I had a Jewish couple that came to faith at the same time together in my congregation, and that was just amazing to see husband and wife both make the decision who had come out of the traditional synagogue. But it's not in the extraordinary, monumental, leaping, and placing yourself between the oncoming car and pushing the child out of the way that heroes are made. It's when ordinary people grab a hold of an extraordinary God and can make a difference. How else can we embrace our ordinary selves and find and draw on a power so much greater than our own?
Sure. Let me give an example. My wife, she has retinitis pigmentosa with Usher syndrome. Hard phrase to say, harder phrase to live with. It means that she's progressively losing her eyesight and her hearing, and yet for me, she puts the her in hero. Every day she gets up, and she has every right to be served. She has every right to sit back and have a pity party and talk about the injustice. And yet every day she gets up and she models servanthood. And my kids get to see in real time what it looks like to trust God in spite of the questions, in spite of the tears, in spite of the frustration. And in fact, one of our theme verses is, I believe, help my unbelief. It's okay to have those hard days. It's okay to ask, why us? Why are we going through this? But to always punctuate it with, but yet we will trust you, God. Yet we will lean into you, God. And my wife gets to do that in a pragmatic way. But the only way we would have the strength, or could have the strength to do that, is it has to come from God. If we were just trying to navigate this all on our own, there's just no way. There's no way. And so daily we have to come back to God, give us your strength. In fact, I've been reading through the book of Isaiah recently for my devotions, and I was just in Isaiah chapter 40 this morning, and he was talking about even the youth grow weary, they grow tired, but they that wait upon the Lord shall renew their strength. And that's something that, you look at the comic book world, yes, Superman, he has to have his fortress of solitude. All of them have something where they have to draw energy, they have to draw strength. And the same thing is true for us, is that we can't be ordinary heroes in this world and have an eternal impact if we try to do it in our own strength. We have to constantly go back to, God, I need you. I need your wisdom. I need your courage. I need your spirit to guide me and to empower me so that I can make a difference in my family, my neighborhood, and those who I run into at the grocery store or the barista at the coffee house who desperately needs you.
It's almost as if God gives us these examples of extraordinary, not so that we would see where we don't measure up, but to see that you don't have to have superpowers to make a difference in this world. It's the next right thing. It's the next act of kindness. It's the ministry of one anothering. The saving of lives, the Lord is the one who saves. If you look at that model of that Acts chapter 2 church, the last line of Acts chapter 2 is, and God added to their numbers daily those being saved. It wasn't Peter, it wasn't the disciples, it was God who adds to the numbers. It's our job to show up and to be present so that we're able to be trusted. To whom much is given, much is required, much is expected. Dan, your message in these last 2.5 minutes, I'd like you to speak to the audience who think that they're unworthy, They're ordinary. They cannot make a difference. They don't matter. They have taken on this cape of invisibility because they don't feel like they can make a difference. What would you say to them?
Sure. D.L. Moody once said that everyone wants to do something great for God. Not very many people want to do something small for God. And it's often those small acts over a period of time that have the greatest impact. It's interesting to me that every comic book hero has a weakness. You know, Superman, it's kryptonite. Wonder Woman, in the comic books, it's being tied up by a man with a rope. Fortunately, the movies got rid of that because it's ridiculous. The Flash, he can't operate unless he has enough calories, so Jenny Craig is his weakness. All of us have vulnerability. All of us have things that threaten to hold. Samson, here he's given supernatural strength, and yet he temporarily loses it because of moral mismanagement. And for each of us, the weakness is different. For some, it could be lust, pride, greed, electronics, not feeling like they're qualified. For me, this last year, it was going too fast. I tried to read over 100 books by listening to the audio on double speed. I would run from task to task, constantly looking for the next thing. I accidentally locked my wife in the car a couple times because she didn't jump out fast enough, and I'd hit the lock button. And so where I'm going with that is that heroes are not the ones without weaknesses. They're the ones who don't allow their weaknesses to keep them from helping others. And so even though you don't feel qualified, even though you don't feel like there's anything of value that you can bring to your marriage, your kids, your school, your church, that's not how God sees you. And you need to start saying, like David, I am fearfully and wonderfully made.
Amen. Amen. Dan Stanford, author of Losing the Cape, The Power of Ordinary in a World of Superheroes. You can find out your ordinary can be extraordinary when you co-labor with the Lord of Lords and the King of Kings, Jesus the Messiah himself. Pastor Dan Stanford, thank you so much for sharing your story with us here on Revealing the Truth.
Thank you. Really appreciate it.
We're going to take a short break, and when we come back, we'll bring you the next edition of Revealing the Truth.